All right. Happy Friday, everybody. I'm here at Studio B. B. Um, I think I haven't done one of these in a while. And the reason has been that I found it since giving up Reddit really slow going, finding a good source. I know that there was a blog roll that was good that was posted, but I don't have I need to get my feed reader back up and running or figure out a good solution for that so I can automatically pull in feeds and do something there to get material. But I've just found it, hey Ian, I've just found it difficult to find where people are posting stuff. The Lemmy group gets dribs and drabs, and I've got one thing from the Lemmy community that we can read in a minute. But other than that, it's been kind of hard. But I thought maybe we can just chit chat about stuff. I'm gonna cruise through Mastodon, see if I can find anything on Mastodon. We'll go through this one, which seems like it might be interesting, called the 7 Maxims of OSR article. We'll do that, then we'll see where it takes us. Ian says they're in a Walmart parking lot on the way to Studio Mountain Cabin for the weekend. Oh. Nice. Well, Mountain Cabin sounds awesome. This is where I am. It's definitely not as remote as a mountain cabin. It feels like it's about as modern as a mountain cabin, but not quite. I can see hills. I can see hills from the windows, but I'm in town. Which actually I actually like. I know that if I had my druthers, right, I really love the idea of being out in absolute middle of nowhere until you have to go get something, and then everything's in the car. And I think one thing, I'm a city kid, born and raised in the city, and one thing I've always appreciated is just being able to walk somewhere. My wife will jump in the car and she'll drive. She doesn't have a problem with it. But me, I like to walk. So I would love somewhere where I could have sort of at least the illusion that I'm out somewhere, where I could turn, look a certain direction, and looks like I'm way, out in nowhere, but still be kind of at least somewhat walking distance of stuff. I mean, I know I'm asking for kind of two opposing things almost. But that would be my kind of dream scenario. Or I just have to get better at just buying everything I need and not having to make like little walks, which would probably work too. And one thing before I forget, the Kickstarter for the Kavlov Sanctuary Old School Essentials Edition, it launched today. We're already funded, which is great. There's a bunch of different options in there. So if you're interested in that, I will throw a link in the chat. Things I can and should have done previously, but I will. I'll throw a link in the chat. I also threw it in the community tab. I put a note in this morning. So if you're interested in that, this is and if you've missed some of the streams, there's I did a couple of streams. Well, one stream where I prepped up a live play that then I did the live play, and then I did kind of a wrap up post live play stream. So there's a lot of content on there. If you're interested, the Between Two Karens did a review the other day. If you want to listen to that, I think it came out yesterday on the Morkbourge version. And there's a stretch goal that if we hit that stretch goal, I will be creating some new material to bolster the book. So looking forward, all those things. So there's the link, and I'll pop it on screen for a minute, and then we'll get down to brass tacks. There it is. I made a Genius link, just helps me with tracking, and also does the shortening bit because some of those links can get long and unwieldy. Okay, let's bring on 7 Maxims of the OSR. This was posted today by All Dead Generations, alldeadgenerations.blogspot.com/2023/08/maxims-of-OSR.html. This is a swig of mint green tea spindrift for the working man. 7 Maxims of the OSR. Back in the aughts and 2010s, a decade ago now, there was a movement in older RPGs that I was a part of, the Old School Renaissance, or OSR. The OSR still hasn't really been defined, or at least its definitions have always been in conflict, now more than ever as it becomes the subject of nostalgic veneration. It's uncontroversial to me sure others will feel incandescently differently. Incandescently differently? All right. That one of the hallmarks of the OSR was the creation of instructive maxims about how to enact its desired playstyle. That playstyle in turn depended on and created an exploration focused elevation of player choice in a strongly referee controlled setting. A strongly referee controlled setting. I'm not sure what that means, but we'll set that aside. The maxims of the OSR were commonly offered to newcomers and now linger in the communities of the post-OSR, where they are too often repeated as if they are unalterable, clear truths obvious to everyone. They aren't, and they weren't. Like most maxims, aphorisms, and pithy bits of common sense, these distillations of OSR gaming wisdom are useful, but only up to a point, and they work best as reminders for people already familiar with their goals. This is a big post. All right. These days, it feels like the post OSR spends a lot of time reinventing things that people wrote on blogs in 2010 or stumbling into the same well known solutions and declaring they have fixed the playstyle. Part of this is a lack of information for people new to these kinds of games, exacerbated by the lack of citations among the hundreds of retro clones that claim to be OSR games. There's little help for this, and as much as instructions to OSR theory like Philotomy's Musings, Matt Finch's Quick Primer for Old School Gaming, or Milton, Lumpkin, and Perry's Principia Apocrypha are useful documents and helpful instructions, the majority of OSR wisdom exists as scattered blog posts and in the minds of people who have engaged with the playstyle over the past 20 or so years. People don't read blogs anymore. But even if they did, these bloggers, designers, referees, and players have a tendency to fall back on maxims when asked to explain elements of the playstyle, and it's not the most efficient way of communicating craft and knowledge. Worse, as the actual creation of the maxims recedes into the past, clouded by memory's failings and wearing into the grooves of dogmatic repetition, they have begun to take on the force of natural laws rather than suggestions or explanations of design decisions and play culture. The power of nostalgia and orthodoxy transforms simplifications and shorthand for larger, complex concepts into definitions that are frequently misinterpreted or carried to lengths that subvert their original meaning and damage the very type of play they were meant to support. Ian says this article reeks of back in my day. And Frederick says people don't read blogs anymore. He means 5e players. Well, I don't know, Frederick. I don't. Is he mean? Because I don't think he's really. I can't imagine that's true. That's because he's not taking aim at 5e. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what it is. I feel like the blog scene is still fairly strong. I mean, my troubles with getting a hold of blog content right now are really troubles of Reddit's making and my own decisions. Not so much that I think that there's a paucity of actual blog posts going. It's just that Reddit did make a great clearinghouse or organizer of stuff that people are posting, and now I feel like either I don't have the right hashtags and Mastodon set up, and we have a few different Lemmy communities, and I don't think people are really posting as much Lemmy as maybe they could or should. I'm not sure how to encourage that other than just saying, hey, post this on the Lemmy, post this on the Lemmy kind of thing. Maybe they're going back to some old forums. I haven't had anything posted to my forum. So I don't know, but I feel like the blogs are still out there. Maybe I think though, depending on if you're using Reddit or not, maybe discoverability has become more of an issue. Ian says that he thinks he's making more reference to younger OSR players and quote unquote new OSR NSR. Maybe. Well, I guess we'll see. All right, so we have I'm not sure, I'm guessing this is a header. You can never go home again. Maxims have such a power in the OSR because it was forced to deal with the convoluted history of early Dungeons and Dragons. It's often and falsely claimed that the goal of the OSR was to play games in the manner of some ideal past table, Gygax's basement in Lake Geneva, or quote-unquote the way D&D was meant to be played. While some undoubtedly tried, this claim and any efforts towards it that actually happened is mostly nostalgic invention, a blend of cognitive distortions and bias that includes rosy retrospection, survivor's bias, selective abstraction, the masked man fallacy, and the halo effect. Problem being that even where it's discernible that through faulty memories, self-aggrandizing claims, and lies made up during IP litigation, the playstyle of early RPGs was constantly in flux. Dungeons & Dragons showed a great deal of conflict and transformation within playstyle from the first, and even within the 1974 edition. For example, the quote-unquote alternate combat system alone suggests an entirely different playstyle than the than the combat rules for chainmail that were originally intended for the game. Worse, depending on one's prior experience or influences, a variety of playstyles and design approaches all seem to fit within the description of quote-unquote old-school RPGs. The bloggers, referees, forum wits, and designers of the OSR struggled to articulate exactly what they wanted, which wasn't uniform among them in the first place. Hey, RPG Grandma. Let's see. Frederick says, new OSR has lots of world books coming out soon. And, yep, Frederick's a big fan of Black Horse Sword Hack Ultimate Chaos Edition, which I have not read yet. But that's not on topic, per se. World books don't really answer whether there's a blogging problem. I don't actually think there is a blog problem. Maybe, I don't know, but maybe this person has analytics that say that people aren't visiting his blog as much, and it's taking that to mean that blogs are, I don't know. But in any case, so here we have some more, and I know there's definitely stuff I'm not sure. There's the way that this treatise, I suppose, is going. I think there's fair and I think good points in here. I wonder if it could be said in a more simple manner, but obviously I think things like there was never one way to play D&D even from the very start. Obviously true. I mean, the two fathers, right, Arneson and Gygax, played differently. Even way back in 1974, forgetting how that once the game got out into the wilderness, how people just played it in all kinds of different ways. And for everybody who played it in the way what we would now call West Marches, I play a lot of folks. I'm probably thinking a lot of the younger folks at the time, including myself when I got involved, played it in a way that we'd be more reminiscent. Well, we played it started a little bit later, but played it differently and differently, so on. There was no single way to play. And I think, and I've definitely seen it where people will trot out these OSR maxims, as this person is calling them, and then when you have discussions with people who actually played back then, or when they're sort of this kind of one true waysm comes up, people will come out and say, no, it's not. You don't have to play that way. It's not necessarily true. We didn't play that way back when. We don't need to play that way now. So I think there's very much some of that. I guess people who are referring to some of these things as dogma as opposed to maybe suggestions, guidelines. If you want to play a certain style, here's some things that help, kind of way. Frederick, I don't think he's talking about that there aren't world. I don't think he's talking about what you think he's talking about, Frederick. I don't think he's saying there's nothing out there to run a campaign with. I don't think he said that anywhere in here. All he said was that people don't read blogs anymore. He hasn't talked about books. He hasn't talked about worlds. He hasn't talked about running campaigns. And the other thing what he is talking about is how people talk about these things. How you go from, say, Matt Finch writing a little handbook of here's some kind of advice kind of thing, to that being then later on people looking at it like these are the laws and those interplay. He's not talking about running campaigns specifically. I mean, he's really talking about the OSR. Instead of representing a quote-unquote rediscovery of a fully functional set of rules, procedures, design, ethos, and play culture of Gygax's Golden Age, somehow lost or destroyed by some ever-growing cast of villains, the Hickmans, the Blooms, Lorraine Williams, Patricia Pulling, and the Satanic Panic, Dungeons and Beavers, Hasbro, Vampire LARPers, Organized Play, or, as always, young people, the OSR was always a place of invention, adaptation. I don't know if it means adoption or adaptation. Maybe adaptation. And revaluation. The OSR playstyle, to the degree any exists, was a new thing that evolved over time in the 2000s and 2010s, influenced by and partially formed from original early RPG texts and long-term play experiences of its members, but necessarily taking in the various ideas and work in RPGs from 1974 to the present. Pithy maxims acted to anchor this decades-long aggregation of hundreds of people's ideas and experiences into vague statements of general principle. Quote-unquote rulings, not rules, is a phrase that one shares like a secret handshake, even if its meaning isn't especially clear. Such statements are great for forming group identity, far more pleasant and long-lasting than railing against a cast of villains and blaming them for a rupture from the nostalgic ideal, but they don't actually explain how to play the game. Whew, okay, there's a lot there. We haven't gotten to the core, I don't think, of what he's saying. So so right now this is kind of a meta. he's talking about sort of the meta conversation about OSR, and that you get to a point, or we're at a point now, in which you have things bandied about like rulings, not rules, that are maybe by the people who would say them are supposed to mean something. Do they mean what you think they mean? Like, what do they mean? If you're just trying to kind of take it at face value, what is it? Kind of thing, right? We haven't gotten specifically any kind of rules, and certainly not into campaigns or anything. Like I said, I think this is kind of a meta discussion about the discussion about and around the OSR, and the fact that I think part of this person's point seems to be, which I wouldn't disagree with, is that OSR isn't really a concrete thing. I mean, it's going to mean different things to different people, and then you're trying to, some people are coming at it like there is some ideal game in the past we're supposed to all be playing exactly like the folks who kind of take that AD&D rules as written sort of thing. That's the law kind of thing, and you have all these different things forming about it, but it's a lot more nebulous maybe than we think it is when we talk about it. But the style is, unfortunately, is a little bit wordy, and I think it could be a little bit more clear. But this is a very long piece, and I feel like he's trying to lay this really thick, heavy groundwork foundations for what he's going to get into, which hopefully we'll see. I was thinking that I only had one article, but this article might take up the whole time. RPG Grandma says there's always been styles. Rulebooks and companies have encouraged certain styles over the years, but there is a range. Yeah, always. And I don't think that he's saying that there isn't or that there shouldn't be. I think what he's saying is it's oftentimes, which I think is true, when discussing the OSR, people will come at it like there is just one, when there isn't, and there never was. And I think that's part of what he's saying. There never was one OSR. There won't be one now. And there was no, even if you're trying to reflect back to some now kind of legendary kind of game, there wasn't one of those either, because there are tons of people playing different ways all the way back to the beginning. So there's no one old school, and there's no one OSR. Frederick says, this is an example of the type of writing I despise of late, just trying to bait and get a rise out of people, then fail to really deliver a resolution. Well, we'll see on the resolution bit, because there's a lot here, and we're only at the beginning. So I don't know if I can say I don't know if he's baiting. I wouldn't say he's baiting people. I mean, obviously there's some things you might take more, get more angry about than others. I wouldn't say that he's baiting you. I don't think or baiting me anyway. Let me put it this way. I don't feel baited by this piece. I don't think he said anything super controversial. I think especially highlighting the bits that I think are most important, I think he's saying things that we would all agree with, right? There's not one OSR. There's not one old school. Now you get into these spaces, and I've seen it happen where people come in and will throw something like, "Oh, rulings, not rules," and then it's like, well, what does that mean? Or does that, and then you have to have seen. I mean, I know I've seen it. Is AD&D not an old school game because it's got tons of rules in it, or something? Right? Or does your game start to not be OSR anymore if you house rule a bunch of stuff, which you tend to over time, because you want to tend to take your great rulings that you have and turn them into rules? I mean, it's natural. It's something that you can see how there could be some confusion about it, especially if you haven't been sort of inundated in the discussion for years and years. iWizard says the best cure for narrativists is DCC, unpredictability at the core. Yeah, I suppose. I don't know. He's not trying to really say anything about, I don't think, narrative gaming or anything. Like I said, this is really, and hopefully we'll get into it now that we're hitting the 7 maxims to decode, but this is really sort of a meta discussion about the OSR. RPG Grandma says first edition games, especially the 70s stuff, required interpretation, innovation, untested rules that don't work, missing information, misleading text, bad, difficult to follow layout or editing. Yes, I would say that stuff is definitely true, and I think that is something that tends to get hidden behind the rose-colored glasses we all look at this stuff. But I find reading, if I had tried to read the three brown books as a kid back in the day, because I wasn't an adult or even a teenager or anything, it would have been really confusing, even more so than something like AD&D, because at least AD&D in a sense is spelling everything or a lot of things out for you. But yeah, I mean, that was something that we tend to forget, that we would fill in, send all those questions to Dragon Magazine, make up our own stuff, and it made for a fun experience when we look at it through our rose-colored glasses. But there are people now that legit, if you release that same game now with all these kind of gaps and weird missing stuff and references to things that you can't actually find in the book, like that wouldn't be reviewed well. If you're like, well, they reference this other book I need to buy, they reference a board game that I need to buy, that there's something missing, that two places in the book say things that don't agree with each other. Like that stuff people would be angry about it now. All right, let's get back to 7 maxims to decode. Maxims differ from aphorisms in that they present themselves as little truths, almost with the force of natural laws. Aphorisms instead ask their audience to think about them and often hint at paradoxes or complexities in a way maxims don't. And again, this is where maxims are great tools for forming group identity, but less effective at teaching or giving their audience any sort of deep understanding. The following maxims were common in OSR spaces and continue to be cited in much of this discussion around OSR and post-OSR playstyle. I haven't generally listed their originators, though I suspect that most of them can be traced to a specific blog post or forum thread, largely because I am lazy, and they are always presented outside of their original context. Without it, they have changed meaning with time, and each is an effort to condense and simplify complex concepts or even arguments from or between numerous other contributors. Instead, all I can offer is my criticisms of the maxim, based on observations of how I've seen it used, and then my personal understanding as someone who was there, or at least peering through keyholes and standing in the shadows when most of these maxims were hashed out. Generally, this is a positive reading. Okay, so now we're getting down to it. We're going to be looking at some OSR maxims, looking kind of how they are now, and then this person saying, hey, I was here during the kind of original OSR movement, and this is so I have some context to shed on them, and presumably stuff like that. So I don't think this could be good now, right? So he's not trying to, I don't think he's trying to bait anybody. I don't think he's trying to poop in everybody. And I think I don't know. Well, we'll just have to see what he says or what they say. I don't know who's responsible for all dead generations. Okay. Number 1, rulings, not rules. Perhaps the ruling maxim of OSR maxims. It's not the most confusing of them either, but it often gets taken to extremes, and sometimes it's presented as a call for removing all rules or for justifying absolute referee control without regard to player expectations or consistency. While rules-free fantasy adventure games, often called the quote-unquote FKR scene, and ultralights with ever more minimal rule sets became quite popular in the later OSR and post-OSR period, 2016-ish to now. The OSR, the old rule sets it took from, and dungeon crawling as I advocate for it. Dungeon crawling as I advocate for it? I'm not sure what that part means. All depend on the consistency and predictability of known rules. The playstyle depends on both mechanics and procedures for the majority of game events, especially the common, expected, reoccurring, and core ones. And these rules also provide models or at least references for ad hoc rulings. I understand the maxim to instead mean 2 related things. 1, RPGs should offer the freedom for characters to act beyond scenarios already contemplated by rules. This is accomplished by referee decisions, ad hoc rulings that should, see the next point, become consistent table rules if the events requiring the ruling occur again. And then second, OSR, classic, and dungeon crawl games all demand a high degree of trust between players and referee. Players must trust the referee to adjudicate unexpected situations fairly, and referees trust players by allowing them to offer unexpected solutions with reasonable chances of success. Both players and referees should not appeal to or demand citations to the rules over the referee's judgment about events. Metagaming and quote-unquote rules lawyering, solutions that are against the quote-unquote spirit of the setting or lack fictional consistency, e.g. the quote peasant railgun, unquote, are considered cheating or unsporting, and the referee can reject them even if the rules as written allow them. Okay, so this is number 1, right? So rulings, not rules. Which he's saying that we see it now, people pointed out, meaning I've never really, first of all, so the point they're making is, okay, so people now use rulings as rules and at times at least take it to extremes and present it as some kind of call for having no rules or not a lot of rules, or for some kind of referee rule 0, I guess would be a thing. Like, that the ruling's not rules, so rule 0, referee controls everything. I can't say I've seen it use that much. I tend to see it when people say, well, what is the OSR? And I'll see people say rulings, not rules. And again, in a way that if you really are curious what the OSR is and you hear rulings, not rules just by itself, I don't know what that's supposed to mean to you. Like my cousins are coming to visit later. And they're like, "Oh, what kind of game are you playing?" And I say, "Well, it's this kind of game." They say, "What's that?" And I say, "Ruling's not rules." And I don't elaborate. They're gonna just be looking at me like, what are you talking about?" So, but I haven't seen it in this context. But I'm just going to trust that they have seen it in this context. In terms of the bullet points, I don't think there's anything controversial here. I think that I almost think let me say what's happening here. I don't think his bullet points are controversial, and I agree with him. That first of all, the whole thing you have to do with a really any rules light game is that you have to trust that either you've given the tools, for example, some kind of generic task resolution in a game. So let's say in a Powered by the Apocalypse type game, we know that everything goes to this, right? Roll 2d6. What do you got to score 9 or more, something like that, right? Everything you do in the game, you could boil down and use this kind of generic thing. That's one way you can have a rules light system, and yet you have a mechanic that covers everything. Then what the referee would have to do with that is figure out from the dynamics of the situation either what you're challenging in terms of, I don't know, something like Dungeon World or whatever. You might be saying, "Oh, that's I forget the names of different moves, but was that defying danger?" So do that. Okay. And in another game, maybe something that's like Rhesus or Rhesus, whatever it's called, then it might be coming up with whatever the difficulty you feel like, "Oh, this is a DC whatever, now use the mechanic." In a D20 game, that would be the same thing. You'd be like, "Oh, okay, this is we're gonna roll your D20 and you can add whatever, and this is a DC 15 here, whatever it is." Or in the case of something like BX, you're given multiple methods are given to you in the book, where it says in the referee side you can use roll under attribute if you want. You can use some kind of X and 6 chance if you feel like that works for you. You can use a D100 if that works for you. Basically, right, you have all these dice, figure out if you know exactly the percentage odds of something are, then you can tell somebody. It's going to be you have a 19% chance of success, so roll and beat 81, something like that, and then go from there. But then ultimately, when you're playing with these rules like games, there are going to be things that fall outside the core mechanics. They're just not. You're not going to have skills for everything under the sun. There are going to be things that at some point you may not fit neatly under one of the attributes, and you're going to have to kind of deal with it. But I also agree with the second point, which is yes, these the second part, I guess, of the first bullet point, which is that if you have a ruling that works, theoretically you should be using that ruling. That ruling should become a rule. That rulings should evolve into rules. The rulings that are good become rules because they're good and they work. And if someone's going to come up, it's one thing if you have a weird situation that it's only going to come up once. But let's say someone's drowning and you needed a ruling for drowning, and whatever your rule set didn't have specific drowning rules. You come up with something, and at the end of the day, it's like, wow, that worked really well. Then the next week, somebody else ends up in a drowning situation. So you go, hey, wow, that worked really well. We're going to use that drowning rules we worked on last week. We're just going to use them. They should really just become house ruled into your rules. So over time, the longer your game goes, theoretically, you should move from maybe you're using a rules light system to not having a lot of rules and making rulings to at some point having more rules and then maybe having less rulings. Let me just take a sip here of Spindrift. And then the second bullet point about trusts and coming up with stuff. Yes, I agree, especially in games that feature the danger levels and things in especially low level OSR style play, is being able to understand what happens. How long do we have? How long does our torch last? And it's always going to last. That's part of why I don't love some of the mechanics. And I haven't played Shadow Dark, but Shadow Dark's 1 hour real time, or in some of the games where it's usage die based or something, so you're going to roll and then it's just you get all these fluctuations where you could potentially light a torch and then your torch goes out a minute later because other things that have really nothing to do with the torch. Whereas I like the fact that there are certain things, there's so much in your game world that as a player you have no control over. Being able to say, like, I light this torch and provided nothing weird happens, now we have an hour of light, I think are key things. And it also comes into mechanics, knowing, okay, we have X amount of chance of a wandering creature every hour we're out here. So that allows us to then make decisions, as opposed to, well, we can't really make decisions, or we can't make decisions having a good framework because the framework keeps shifting on us every return. But though I don't know if that part would really fit under the rulings, not rules. but maybe in the aspect that in the trust part, that as players you're trusting the GM that they're doing all this stuff and they're not futzing around with you, and they're going to kind of play it straight and fair. I guess maybe is where the rulings part comes in. Ian says that they like usage dice, but they would have a minimum time before you start rolling. Oh yeah, you can definitely find ways. I think usage dice are really clever. I mean, as a concept, I think it's really clever, and I think I could definitely find uses for it. I don't think I need it for torches. I don't. I feel like torches for me is not where I would use it. Hey, Swizz. Okay, so that was number one. Let's go to number two. The answer isn't on your character sheet. Similar in intent and effect to rulings not rules, this maxim rejects the dominance of rule or specifically mechanic-based solutions to game puzzles and problems. Players are supposed to observe and ask questions about the fantasy environment and then solve problems by describing actions that use the resources described to logically overcome obstacles rather than testing a skill listed on the character sheet. The OSR character finds secret doors by tapping walls with a 10-foot pole and listening for hollow spaces rather than rolling to spot hidden. While there is truth to this being an aspect of the playstyle, the maxim speaks in absolutes that don't match the rule sets or experience of most OSR-style games. Dungeons & Dragons gains progressively more skills with each new edition, but even the earliest contains roles for finding secret doors and avoiding traps. When the Thief class is added in the first supplement, skill tests become an established game element. Similarly, spells and equipment have always been tools that players are meant to write on their character sheet and use to solve problems in play. A huge number of spells, especially ones named after early characters like Tensor's floating disc, are solutions to specific in-game problems. So what does this maxim mean? Instead of being an admonishment against character complexity, it's more about adventure design and the focus of play. The game should present complex but logical obstacles and expect players to solve them using logical reasoning and using objects in the fantasy world around them in interesting and unexpected ways. The referee and designer should give clues relatively freely when players offer logical actions or uncover them and respond to logical solutions to obstacles and puzzles without hiding clues or success behind unnecessary skill checks or other roles. And finally, adding to these two goals or practices, the best player solutions are those that don't require any rolls or checks at all and don't waste character resources like equipment, hit points, or spells. This sort of open-ended problem solving is a core part of play rather than something secondary to combat or interacting with NPCs and shouldn't be elided with skill checks. Okay, so again, I don't think there's anything that I find really disagreeable about what they're saying here. Sometimes the answer is on your character sheet. I mean, but I think where I like to look at it is I want to encourage players that the answer doesn't have to be on their sheet, because I think that's the inverse of this is right. The answer, it's more like it's more like the answer isn't necessarily on your character sheet. Sometimes it is. If you're a thief and you're trying to do something, the answer is, oh, do I have this skill for this? Oh, yes, I do. Right, do it. I think as a GM, we'd still want some fictional positioning to make it work, as opposed to what you see in some games where it's like I roll look for traps, where you really want somebody to get into it, but in the end you're still going to be your thief rolling for your trap detection skills or whatever skills. Or someone says I'm an elf, so can I make my roll for secret doors, because elves have that, like, what is it, 1 in 6 or 2 in 6 of getting a secret door. So there certainly is sometimes when the answer is actually on your character sheet, or at least an element of the answer. But maybe a better way to put this, though, I think part of the reason why these things become maxims is because they're really snappy and they're really straightforward and they're punchy and they don't try to. I think part of what makes a maxim powerful is the lack of nuance, unless the nuance is really baked into it. Because really, what we're saying, I think, when people are talking about this, and at least they're speaking thoughtfully and they're not just spitting out things at you, is the answer isn't entirely on your sheet. That what we're doing here was we're playing as a player is you are taking the stuff on your sheet because it tells you about yourself, and you are also taking the stuff that's in this fictional world we built together and taking the two of them and then synthesizing your actions out of this. So yes, there are certain elements that are on your character sheet. If I'm playing a character, I might need to remind myself how strong or fast or whatever I am, because that should affect what I'm picking. Because if I'm playing in a game where, let's say, BX and the GM uses a lot of roll under attribute, I'm not going to pick a solution that relies on my dexterity if my dex stinks. It's because I want to try to play to my character's strengths, whatever they may be. So yes, that will be looking at my character sheet and taking that into account. And looking at whatever equipment I have. Where's my equipment located? It's on my character sheet. So if I need to know if I have rope or a crowbar or iron spikes or a hammer or whatever it is, a mirror, I need to look on my sheet. But that shouldn't be everything. It shouldn't just be my sheet. It should be looking at my sheet, synthesizing with the world, or taking the world, synthesizing them together, coming up with an action. But that's a horrible maxim. So people just say, hey, the answer's not on your sheet. Get your head out of your sheet. And sometimes you don't need your sheet, but sometimes you do. But I think to their point, when you've made this great maxim, but if all you do is you look at that and you lose some of the background detail, much like you see, like when someone on social media just posts this little quote, and if you just read the quote, it's like, oh my gosh, and then you read it and you realize, oh my god, and it's, we call it a bait and switch, but sometimes not even just that. It's just having the context makes it seem a lot less crazy or extreme or whatever is than the original little quote. And I think that some of these probably suffer from that. But again, I don't think there's anything super controversial. I feel like the audience for this blog post is, or at least what he's hoping to do, whether he'll succeed or not. I think when you have an article that's this long and this dense, written in this way, I think some folks might just be like, oh my gosh, I'm not playing it. But I feel like his audience is for folks who may be running into this stuff. So what we was saying, like if we take, let's say, the original OSR from, say, the mid-aughts to, say, 2015, say 10 years, right? Let's just say, I don't know the dates, maybe slightly off, but I don't care. Just for this, we're going to say 2005 to 2015 is the classic OSR period. Now you have people who are 8 years past that. We have people who are now kind of discovering the OSR that are not dissimilar from the folks who in 2005 were looking back 8 years to, 1997, or maybe a little bit further to the kind of the right. So people are now coming back and looking at the OSR. Maybe some of the OSR people were looking back at some of the newer, at the time, older editions. And they're coming up on all these discussions that are taking place and seeing all these things put out and not having the context. Like, we take for granted that we've been reading all this stuff for 10, 15 years. Now we have this audience, or there is an audience out there who's not aware of all that. A lot of it went away with Google Plus, blogs died, Reddit now stinks, whatever. So they're seeing these things posted, but not with all the background. So this person's trying to kind of deliver the background, which I think is actually really good. I think it's a good idea, a good thought. Now, I don't know if the method and the manner in which they're going to do it is maybe a little bit too much for that they could kind of make it more user-friendly. Like, hey, you've heard this. This is what you might context you might hear it in, but here's kind of what it really means. Anyway, that's just my 2 bits. But let's keep going, because I feel like if this progress bar is any indication, either there's a lot of comments or there's a lot going on here. All right, number 3, role-playing, ROLE playing, not role-playing, ROLL playing. Another argument for the essential nature of OSR play, the one that long predates the OSR, first offered in 1980, has been picked up by numerous cultures of play. In the context of the OSR, early systems or dungeon crawl games, it's an interesting maxim, because these games are often inspired by the earliest understanding of RPGs as an extension of war games, the quintessential role-playing activity. That the maxim appeared somewhat commonly in OSR spaces and continues to appear in post-OSR ones, as well as contemporary traditional communities for games like 5th edition D&D, is a response to specific foundational claims about the OSR. In OSR and post-OSR context, role-playing, not role-playing, tends to mean little more than disdain for the alleged focus of later editions on character building and tactical, feat-centered combat. As dogma, though, it's more pernicious than most maxims here because it's more vague and more contemptuous of other playstyles. Obviously, one rolls dice a fair bit in OSR or dungeon crawl play, and compared to several other playstyles, does so more often. This does not mean that role-playing, not role-playing can't be read in a positive way. In general, removing unnecessarily die rolling and complexity from a game is good design because it speeds things up. Yet too much simplification, too much minimalism can detract from play. Not just abandoning rules, but failing to provide assistance to referees in other ways, a lack of sample monsters or equipment in a rulebook, or the tendency towards system-neutral adventures that never consider how complex and strange monster attacks or effects can be mechanically modeled. There's a point where demanding too much role playing and not enough ROLL playing runs counter to the dungeon crawl style of play, which depends on risk taking and risk management as a key part of play. This problem of excessive minimalism is also found in the discussion of quote unquote fruitful voids, the use of spaces left in game design, very common in early RPG design, that the referee must fill, often with the help of the players. Such voids are good when they mark areas of play, such as negotiation with monsters or unpuzzling obstacles, that are meant to be freeform and depend on open-ended problem solving. But when they are everywhere, one doesn't have a game. One has a mediocre at best prose poem in the form of an instruction manual or gazetteer. There are more interesting lessons one can take from role playing, not role playing. Okay, so the first one of these is avoiding unnecessary die rolls is more than having a simple system. It's also an aspect of role playing. In the case of older style dungeon crawl or OSR games, which are focused on problem solving rather than, say, genre emulation and story creation, this means not making every solution require a die roll. When players come up with a good plan that doesn't involve anything risky and obviously subject to fate, the referee doesn't roll anything and doesn't ask players to roll anything. In terms of the maxim, they've role-played their way through the obstacle or problem. Of course, this is a referee skill and a key one, knowing when to roll and when not to. And that's something to get to with the next maxim. And then second, it's not usually worth it to ask for a roll that doesn't involve a high degree of risk and consequences. If the goal of role-playing for a dungeon crawl game is to plan and scheme in such a way that the dice never have to clatter across the table, it's hardly fair for the referee to force rolls when there's a tiny possibility of risk that players have been led to believe isn't there through the metagame, as when they are in town versus in the dungeon or wilderness, or risks that the players don't have the opportunity to anticipate or find clues about, with rare exceptions. Yeah, I don't, again, this is one of these things where I don't know that he's talking about it being applied in ways that I'm not sure I've seen it really applied in. I'm trying to think about when I usually see the role playing, not role playing. I mean, there's the one thing where I think it tends to be where I've seen it. And if you're in the chat and you correct me or whatever, I'm really talking about what I see it. And I don't feel like it's come up that much lately, but it could be because I've been out of the blog loop a little bit also lately. In the kind of counter to sort of the min-maxi kind of thing, where if you look at the player who we'd look at, say, a power gamer type is maximizing all their roles, one might respond by saying, I'm trying to role play ROLE, play rather than roll dice kind of thing. And that's where I've tended to see it. I can't say that I've seen it much in terms of whether as a defense or something about a rule system or module that gives you a lot of blank spaces or anything like that. Though, again, I'll just take it on this person's word that they have seen it used in those ways. I think this is probably something that's really worth a bigger discussion because there's a lot of interesting interplays between these two ideas. And I've talked about in the past that as a player, my goal is how much can I get through without rolling the dice? Because rolling the dice invites failure, and that if I can keep talking, I don't have to do. So if I can talk my way around climbing up a wall without having to roll dice, then I'm going to just succeed. Because in the end, the referee is going to go, okay, great, you've done it. Whereas if the referee looks at me and goes, roll dice, then suddenly there's a chance of failure, and failure with any consequences that come of failure. So, my goal as a player is how much can I do before I got to roll dice? Is kind of my thing. And then I think to the point from the GM side, I think there's a lot of things that I like to think about, which is one, I just like a general flow. And for me, oftentimes the flow, the dice interrupt the flow. If you could get back into it, it can kind of get submerged in the flow. Because I don't think we tend to look at the dice negatively when we're really in the groove, because sometimes what the dice do end up being really additive. But it also at the same time is I can just be role playing a situation. The last thing I want to do is stop everything to do dice. And as a GM, I think you have to be mindful of the fact that when you ask the players to roll dice, you are inviting failure. And is that something that is additive to the situation? Especially when it is like I've seen, it's like, oh, you got to climb a 40-foot wall. Now you're going to need to roll. You're going to roll your climbing check once every 10 feet. It's like, so I got to make 4 rolls, which sounds maybe that's really easy, but still it's 4 chances I could roll a nat 1, which has a flat, we're talking a D20 system. That's a 5% chance flat. Every time I roll the dice, 5% chance. So even if I was going to succeed on everything else, there's an increasing opportunity for me to critically fail, or depending on how you roll, whatever, fail or critically fail, for a task that maybe in the end we're trying to say is easy. And if it is easy for me, then why am I rolling? Why can't you just let me do it? It's not like the orcs are on my tail and or the rope's burning or something else is happening. I have an opportunity to do things, to climb in a thoughtful, prepared, careful way. So just, let me have it. RBG Grandma says, also rolling constantly can bog down a game to a standstill. Yes, absolutely. When you start rolling for every little thing, yeah, it slows things down. All right, on to the next one. Don't fudge dice. Given the advice in cursed 1990s dungeon mastering manuals like Play Dirty and XDM, which encourage tricking and forcing your players to experience exactly the plot one intends, this can be controversial advice in trad and even 5th edition or other contemporary traditional game spaces. It's also one of the only maxims here I can agree with fully, though there are caveats. Not fudging dice assumes a sort of ideal referee who never drinks 2/3, is that 2/3? Is that 2/5? 2/3 a bottle of Tempranillo during play, or has a weird day at work that sticks with them while they are running the game. It assumes the referee never makes mistakes that get the game into a situation where fudging the dice feels necessary to maintain fairness. This sort of thing really does happen, though far less often than it can when pushing the players down a narrative path. Not fudging dice has a more important corollary in role-playing, not role-playing, see above, and recently a mystical cultic sort of reading. Let's call it the oracular power of the dice, or the Cult Dungeon Master's Guide appendices. However, to get why this maxim makes sense to me, though I like the oracular power of dice, so maybe I'm part of the Cult Dungeon Master. So here, however, to get why this maxim makes sense to me, first, don't fudge dice. No, really don't. It's sort of a little test of the concepts above. Refereeing shouldn't feel antagonistic, and fudging dice is usually based around softening antagonistic refereeing, while giving the referee a sort of absolute but deniable power to inflict good or bad events based on a whim. If you roll constantly and the dice are always mere suggestions, then it's really the referee and not the dice deciding when things matter. This creates distrust among the players who can no longer feel like their choices matter, and often creates the appearance of favoritism. I would agree. And I think the other thing, there's a bunch of there's a bunch of bullet points for this one. So I'll save my thing to the end, but I certainly agree with that first part. RBG Grandma says, that they're a player in a 5th edition game set in an older setting that has been updated for 5th edition, and already our DM has noticed a huge difference in our playing and other groups. One, we exercise caution as needed. So if survived areas, other 5e groups have TPK'd. I don't doubt it. There's a certain playstyle that comes with, I think, when you cut your teeth on the older versions of the games, that I think certainly, in terms of the gaming parts, will make you a better group. And I mean better in terms of things like not the role-playing part of it, but just surviving. Surviving? Because there's just certain, like I've always been someone that I get into a game and, I'm like, I want my player to survive. Like, I feel like I'm that, like Robert De Niro character in Ronin, when he's the only one asking where the exits are. It's like, I want my guy to get out. I'm not trying to get into a spot where I can't get out, things like that. And I think when you get used to playing like that, you come into a 5th edition game, that sort of those experiences serve you well. All right, second bullet here. Trust in the referee and trust in the integrity of the dice is important because players need to trust the referee to present the world in a way that they can understand and where they can judge risks prior to rolling the dice. One of the skills for an OSR or classic referee is to have the authority to stand by decisions and the adventure design in good or bad circumstances. Fudging dice often looks like a referee trying to direct play while pretending dice are forcing them to do so. Accountability for and ownership of the setting's response reinforces itself, though, building trust between players, with the referee, and with the integrity of the setting. All of this is useful when one is running a game with high risk to the characters, because in moments where characters die or fail, the referee needs to be perceived as a neutral arbitrator who doesn't impede the players' victories, but also enforces logical consequences of their mistakes. No one wants to lose in an unfair game. Okay, then next one. As previously noted, when not fudging dice, a key skill is picking when to ask for a roll. It's often better to simply not roll the dice if there are consequences that one would avoid by changing the roll afterward. And if one realizes too late, it's better to own up to making a mistake rather than trying to trick the players. And then finally, don't depend on dice to do everything as a referee either. The point of not fudging dice is to offer a world with integrity and clear, consistent rules, e.g. swords do D8 damage. Randomness is great. It's part of what makes RPGs fun and different from storytelling, but while random tables can be inspiring, they are not a substitute for referee intelligence or designer diligence in creating the setting. Creating random dungeons without later editing tends to create incoherent and or extremely bland fun houses, while providing a small set of tables to fill 50 rooms won't offer a workable adventure. In play as well, there needs to be spaces where the referee simply says no for the setting to make sense. Even without fudging, rolling for every absurdity while using the popular 1 always fails and 20 always succeeds rule breaks down referee responsibility to provide a reasonable reaction from the setting and player responsibility to puzzle through the game's obstacles. Of course, it's better to simply say there's no chance rather than fudge this kind of roll. And again, I don't think there's anything I would say here. I don't think that that's controversial or anything. I think it's a good clarification of what don't fudge the dice means. And look, I think that GMs, I think especially new GMs, don't want to really, you want to put the players in jeopardy, but you don't want to kill off the characters. I don't think, I'm sure there's some GMs out there that have some fun with it, and in some kind of one shot or something can be fun. But I as much as when I'm playing the game, and if I'm looking at it, my ideal game would be something like a Lord of the Rings in terms of this progression from kind of a thing to defeating a massive world-shattering Dark Lord. Everything is wonderful. So as much as any of the players want that their players, their characters, especially the first ones, to be the ones that are able to go through this whole story. But some of them are not going to make it. Some of them are going to go down early. Some of them are going to go down in the middle, and maybe some of them will go down at the end. Maybe none of them at all. And I think, but at the same time, I feel like you have to kind of let it happen. And when you start trying to prevent it through fudging, then to the point I think they're making is that you're losing something, a little bit of the integrity of your game. And I think that the thing is that I was waiting to see if they mentioned that they haven't, is that I think this stuff is a lot more transparent than GMs think it is. I think your players probably know you're fudging if you're doing it a lot. If you fudge once in a blue moon for something, probably no one's going to know. If I fudge dice in one of my games by screen, I doubt anyone's going to figure it. Maybe if I was playing with it over a long enough time, people would notice it. Like there's a tell where I start to look down at the dice, and then I kind of have a little look in my eye, and then I start having to, because I can't just read out the result. I have to kind of think about what the result that I want. But I think if you're doing this and it's a part of your normal part of your game, I think you're kidding yourself if you don't think your players know. They may not care enough about it to make a thing about it, because I think a lot with players, like people, is most people are going to put up with a lot for different reasons. And gaming is just one of those things, just like anything. You enjoy being with your groups, you enjoy playing, you're all friends. If that's the situation, you're probably going to, as your friends are putting up with your kind of peccadillos and things, people are going to put up with stuff. Well, I love my GM. He kind of runs a railroad, but we do it anyway, right? Okay, fine. Or I love my GM, but he does this thing, kind of drives me nuts when it comes up, but whatever, it's fine. I love playing the game. It's the only chance in the week I get to see my friends and do this thing that I like. So I'm going to put up with a little bit. Like, players are going to put up with a lot before they say anything. I think that most folks, for the most part, regardless of what you hear on the internet with people saying, like, I'm going to quit at the drop of a hat and give you a 50-page dissertation on why I quit, most people are going to stick with it. So you don't know. You may think as a GM, I'm fudging this dice all the time and nobody can know, and it's the most wonderful thing in sliced bread. And you're saying, well, they haven't told me, so it must be fine. It must be undetectable, undetected. And I'm here to tell you, it's probably been detected. They probably know. And even if you ask them flat out, like, hey, are you having fun? What's going on? They're probably not going to tell you, because you're their friend and they enjoy the game. And they're probably thinking, what's the point about making somebody feel bad over this little thing? Or, it is what it is, or whatever. So I think that would be the other thing is I think people think of fudging the dice oftentimes as this technique, which is invisible. So it's okay to do it because nobody will ever know but me. Well, they probably know. Okay. Number 5. Play the world, not the rules. A less common maxim, At least in this form. Sometimes it gets phrased in other ways or as related maxims like create situations, not stories, or sandboxes, not railroads. This maxim is an affirmation that the game is concerned with player choice and creating a setting or adventure where anything is possible. Because things outside the rules as written follow logical patterns and likely results can be deduced from the player's real world knowledge. For example, water flows downhill and wolves or their equivalent eat meat. The maxim also speaks to world design, claiming that the adventure is not a narrative within a setting, but the player interactions with the setting as a whole. Adventures don't advance in a predictable manner, but represent the exploration of locations to steadily increase character power and involvement with the setting's secrets, factions, and larger scale events. Both of these ideas can cause a lot of confusion. The maxim itself only touches on them, and the idea of a sandbox and absolute player freedom tend to be daunting. The referee might feel the need to design an entire world before the first session or prepare a huge number of locations. Likewise, the idea of absolute freedom can stun players. It's hard enough to know what to do with your life in the real world, but an RPG player has little or no idea of what's even possible in a new setting. What's expected of them and their character? How do they go about it? This isn't the way to start a good campaign, and it's intuitively obvious to a lot of people hearing these maxims that it won't work very well. Of course, that's also not what the maxim means, or not exactly. All right, so he's got two long bullet points here. First, a sandbox setting is open for players to do anything, but this has reasonable limitations built into the structure of the game and culture of play. Of course, most players don't start off with a plan, they don't know the setting, and they don't know what to do. The referee needs to provide clues about where the party can find adventure. This is the reason rumors and hooks are a regular subject for discussion in OSR and post-OSR spaces. They are how the referee gives players information about what opportunities exist for them. Hooks and rumors are mere suggestions, however, and they are a way to give players information without forcing them to read or listen to long descriptions of a setting and its lore. Generally, this works for players because they want to play a game about dungeon crawling or adventuring, and hooks and rumors offer that. Of course, some players instead want to run cookie shops or go on a dating binge through the NPCs. When this comes up, it's usually a mismatch with the group or an effort to test how free they really are to make decisions. I tend to ask the player to retire the wayward PC, making them into the local baker or CAD, at least if the player's goal is outside what the rest of the players want to focus their few hours a session on. The whole party wants to bake fancy cookies or something that doesn't lend itself to typical adventure activities. Maybe it's time to find a game or play style that supports these kinds of slice of life goals better. And then second, playing the world shouldn't be a daunting... Oh, actually, there's more bullet points. How many are there? Okay. All right, we're getting there. This article's going to take over the hour to read, so I had one. I only needed one. Playing the world shouldn't be daunting for the referee either. The joy of an open world might be infinite opportunities, but sure, characters can go off and do anything, but the world doesn't have to let them succeed or make it easy. Danger abounds, and the setting pushes back on player goals. The referee or designer isn't required to gate or zone dangers for player level, reducing the risk of whatever the players want to seek out to something they can triumph over. And poor plans might not have a chance to succeed. Since most players are logical and want their characters to survive, this isn't an issue. They seek out the risks and locations they feel like they can handle rather than run straight at the most powerful and dangerous location they hear about. This means that the smart referee doesn't need to prepare everything, just the content that characters have immediate access to for a session or two, with enough options to provide some potential variety. Of course, a vague idea of what else is beyond this immediate area is helpful when players start to get a wanderlust or overestimate their character's abilities. The scale of the world is large. One isn't playing through a specific story or to reach some conditions set by the rule. The goal is more experiencing what's possible in the setting, aided by the structure the rules create. This becomes most important when looking at the comparatively high character death rates in most original OSR or post-OSR games. High lethality works because there's a whole world to explore that can evolve and change regardless of a specific character's fate. The player need only promote a hench person or roll up a new PC, something they can do anyway on a whim, retiring their current PC to run a bakery or something, to keep the game's story going. In many contemporary games, because they are built with the individual character as a centerpiece, character arcs and backstories that set up specific narrative for the whole campaign, this seems unworkable or counterintuitive, but within the OSR and affiliated playstyles, there's more emphasis on discovering the character stories in play, even if this is dying early in the campaign to become an aspect of the surviving characters' stories. Now, finally, and on a smaller scale, Playing the setting and not the rules references the way OSR and similar games encourage players to find solutions outside the rules using previously discovered elements of the setting and from referee descriptions to succeed in their goals. This isn't the same as realism, though. Like reasonable fictional limitations, player knowledge, innovation, and scheming isn't limited by what's realistically possible or with a great deal of specificity. Simple game logic solutions work without determining the exact science or chances of success from real-world models. One doesn't need to look at strength under tension and maximum loads by material to determine if a party can ascend a rope grappled to something. The combination of rope and grappling hook is sufficient. Okay. Again, like I said, I don't find anything to really argue about there. I'm just trying to see how much. Okay, so we got 2 more left. All right, let's do this. All right, I think I need another drink. I very much wish this person could have maybe distilled this down a little bit. I think if it maybe a little bit less formal. I don't even think you really need the history lesson. Just get into it. Here are these maxims that I see. Here's how I think, here's kind of what I think, and then kind of bing, bam, boom. Something like that. What I think would have made this a lot peppier and not an hour's worth of reading to get to. But we're almost there, people. We're almost there. Combat is a fail state, and that's number 6. This maxim is somewhat dubious, but also acts as important pushback against certain tendencies in the older rule sets and playstyles of early Dungeons and Dragons, and the common insult or complaint that OSR games are simply hack and slash combat. Combat being where all the rules are. The OSR long denied this argument, but still had to grapple with the large amount of combat rules and tendency for games to constantly devolve into combat. Combat is, of course, one of the most obvious ways to resolve a lot of common RPG problems, and the OSR commitment to player choices and sandboxes tend to mean it's almost always an option. In early Dungeons and Dragons, there may be some truth to the idea that combat as a major goal and focus for play. Parties were expected to be much larger, 8 to 14 players each with 1 to 2 characters and a henchman or 5. These big parties can engage in far more combat with far more success than trad and OSR style groups of 3 to 8 adventurers and fewer henchmen. Additionally, there's some weight to the idea that when writing OD&D, Gygax and Artisans saw it as a supplement to, perhaps even a minigame for larger wargame scenarios, meaning that the characters were closer to wargame pieces than the RPG concept of the character. This would make party losses fairly meaningless as they are simply soldiers in the player's army. Both early trad, here the parenthetically Hickman era TSR, and OSR playstyles have dealt with this contradiction between rules and play conditions in distinct ways. Trad by creating the adventure path, where combat challenges are carefully structured with the aim of balance, testing but not killing the characters. The OSR has opted to retain a more open setting and player-driven narrative, and so defensively calls out combat as a fail state. Why defensive? Trad and now contemporary trad, or OC players and designers, long the vast majority in the hobby, tend to fear and mock the possibility of open worlds and wide player freedom, often citing the worry that players will become murder hobos, wandering about and killing everything and everyone to gain wealth and with it XP. This is not a classic OSR or post-OSR problem, though. An open world can and often has baked-in tools like factions push back against marauding bands of killers, or alternatively, let players experience a bandit or criminal campaign. The murder hobo, to the degree he exists and barring the most actively antisocial players, is not a threat to a sandbox campaign. In an adventure path, though, antisocial characters are a threat because they make the characters heroes into villains and disrupt the adventure structure, which has no alternatives built in. This is the flip side of the danger that PvP poses in OSR and related games versus the way it can easily be incorporated into adventure paths or story arcs. So combat as a fail state expresses a distinctive aspect of the OSR playstyle, an adaptation to using rules designed for large parties with smaller ones in an open world full of asymmetric threats. It unfortunately does so in an often angry, defensive, and reductive way that runs counter to most people's actual game experience. Combat will happen in an OSR game or dungeon crawl, and likely pretty often. What does the maxim capture then? First, combat is war. Another OSR catchphrase serviced from a famous N-World thread back in the 2010s. The idea that newer types of D&D offer combat as sport, balanced towards tactical contests played out through rules of the system. The OSR playstyle provides combat as war instead, conflict where following the rules is dangerous and likely deadly, because power between combatants is asymmetrical. Good players should stack every advantage and find solutions like traps, ambushes, and deception before fighting. Combat is a fail state is broader, though. It offers the possibility that it's better to win without fighting. Deception, alliance, bribery, and simply going around dangerous enemies are better solutions than dangerous combat. Of course, old D&D and most OSR or post-OSR games still have lots of combat rules. Plus, even my own games usually include a combat encounter each session. My argument has been crushed underneath logic and praxis, or alternatively, rules aren't always the most dense around parts of the game where the players are expected to spend the most time or which represent ideal play. Rules are also necessary for parts of the game that are most contentious and require the most clarity. That's what I really think, and I've said this multiple times. I don't think that there are tons of rules about combat necessarily, because combat is the thing that we're supposed to be doing the most time, but it is where it's going to be the most contentious and where tensions are going to be highest because it's life or death for the characters. There's plenty of rules in most sports about what constitutes foul play, but that doesn't mean that basketball is about throwing elbows and running around holding the ball. The same with OSR-style exploration games. Combat is the most likely place where the players will lose. That is where their characters will die, and so players will try to scheme their way out of the risks even after combat has commenced, something the playstyle rejects because combat is also how bad player decisions and risk-taking manifest. Combat needs to be hedged in by rules precisely because in the OSR style of play, it's an area where player choice is constrained to a greater degree than in most parts of play. The extensive rules have a preclusive effect, filling the area of play, preventing even well-thought-out player schemes or referee rulings from lessening the impact of combat's threat to character survivability. Ian says this could have been 5 punchy articles. Probably. And RPG Grandma says, I still blog, but would not post something this big. Ian also says, nobody reads blogs, writes long meandering blog. Yes, this is a bit. Yes, they could have definitely split this up into 7, 1 for each one. Would have been very doable. I will say that just going to point out, I pointed out again, but the classic example of this kind of rule space is the game Diplomacy, which has 0 rules in the game about diplomacy. All the rules are about your troop movements, and the reason why is because those are the essential where all the things are coming. All the stuff we were doing. You're spending the vast majority of diplomacy where you're out scheming in the hallways or little corners of the room, trying to talk it out. That stuff's just between folks, right? It doesn't need any rules. In fact, I think it not having rules is a feature, not a bug, because you're constantly making and breaking these alliances. Things are only as good as your word. So there's no rule locking you in. All the rules are always interlocking. Well, when you're starting to read the order of actions, which ones succeed, which ones fail, things that happen, right? All those movements, that's where all the rules are. And yet the game is called Diplomacy. And clearly anyone that's played Diplomacy would say that the game is mostly about that and not about the movement of troops, but that's not where all the rules are. But yes, this totally could have been 7 articles, each one on each one of these. On one of these. Might have been easier. But hey, look, I had the hour. We spent the hour. I needed an article. Can't say this one didn't do what I needed it to do. RPG Grandma says they just started a deep dive on MAs. What's MA? RPG Grandma. I'm trying to think of what that is. Including comparing between D&D and Games Workshop, and the first post is shorter. Oh, mechanics. MA's rules. MA's? MA, Massive Army? Mass Attack? Massachusetts? But send me a link, RPG Grandma. Send me a link to your Metamorphosis Alpha. Okay, thanks. Yeah, I would not have it would have taken me a long time to get around to Metamorphosis Alpha. Interesting. Not Games Workshop, Gamma World. Okay, so you're doing a deep dive on Metamorphosis Alpha's rules, including comparing them between D&D and Gamma World, and their first post is short. Yes, there's a lot there. I have Metamorphosis Alpha somewhere. It's not here though. I'd be interested. Send me the link, and if Nightbot strikes you down, if Ian can't save it from moderation, then find it elsewhere and shoot me over or just put your blog name and I can look it up. Not for this week, but maybe next week. Check it out. Or go to Lemmy and post it, or go to my forums.hex.press and post it, but get it to me somehow, RPG Grandma. I implore you. All right, last one. Number 7. Strict time records must be kept. On page 37 of the first edition of the Dungeon Master's Guide, Gygax writes, you cannot have a meaningful campaign if strict time records are not kept. a famous quote, and not just because it's in all caps. For Gygax, though, it isn't a general comment. It relates specifically to campaign play, downtime, and upkeep costs. It's not about dungeon turns or combat order, but the logistics of a many-session campaign and the specific sort of open-table public game that Gygax advocated for. Bookkeeping and a calendar to keep track of dozens of players and characters coming and going in the setting over months or years. So, originally, this maxim isn't even about most parts of play. It was long treated in the OSR space as a sort of humorous overreaction by Gygax, an old man shouting at clouds. Of course, this shows another fracture point between OSR design concerns and Gygax's early playstyle. Gygax considered long public campaigns with more wargame-like features the proper structure of play, while the OSR, especially in its middle years, tended to focus on individual adventures or unique settings with even larger but less committed casts of characters via the online, I don't know, never heard this before, Constacon. More recently, post-OSR design has moved toward minimal rule sets, and many newcomers from the contemporary traditional game space are getting interested in older rule sets. In this context, strict time records must be kept has become an actual maxim and acts as a reminder that turn-keeping and related rules are the legs that classic-style exploration stands on. The actual maxim, though, doesn't do much to explain this, still having the bizarre quality of Gygax's original outrage, and can lead to confusion, focusing on the minutiae of tracking resources, distance, and in-game time rather than the essential element. The mechanics and procedure of turn-keeping, dungeon navigation, encumbrance, supply depletion, and random encounters matter as structural supports to location exploration, but the specifics are malleable depending on many factors: design goals, session length, party size, and setting fiction. All right. Whew. To understand strict time records must be kept. What? I'm not sure why it puts it like that. And records, strict time records. Oh boy. RPG Grandma's got mandatory government employee training. Well, have a great day. Thanks for joining RPG Grandma. Send me that link later and good luck with the training. It's a shame you're missing right before we get to the end. So finally, to understand strict time records must be kept in the OSR and post-OSR sense, consider in a playstyle about overcoming obstacles through a problem-solving exploration. The first obstacle is the layout, size, and paths through the location or dungeon, navigation, or orienteering. The dungeon, of course, contains fixed risks, traps, monsters, factions, and puzzles that limit access to its rewards, traditionally treasure. The best way to overcome or avoid these risks or obstacles is to go around them and approach everything with extreme caution. The common complaint about tapping 10-foot poles in great corridors exemplifies this. Its answer is built into old dungeon exploration design, the randomized risk of wandering monsters and the depletion of necessary supply, especially light. While there are mechanics directly supporting both, random encounter checks and encumbrance, they require turn-keeping to know when monsters threaten the party and when supplies are used. Regular turn-keeping also gives the players a rough idea of when supply loss and random encounters will occur, or at least have a chance to, and so lets them make decisions about risk and reward. How much caution can they afford? That's the core function or loop in dungeon crawling. So strict time records must be kept, or at least the passage about time and accumulating risk needs to be supported with rules precisely to avoid a boring game where exploration has no risk or danger associated, and it's mostly a waste of time. Ian wants to try the Shadow Dark's Always On initiative. Ian, if you tried, let me know. I am curious about that. The original Gygaxian concept of strict time records is campaign focused, and these days it is usually expressed as one-to-one time. One-to-one time is an approach to campaign downtime where days pass at the same rate in the game world as they do in the real one, except during a session. This can cause issues, of course, when the action of a single session takes place over many days in the game world, but it's an interesting and generally functional way to encourage multiple parties or even referees at the same table and multiple characters for individual players. It was never a common OSR practice, however, despite interest, and works best for regular public games at a hobby shop or large online community. For home-style games with mostly consistent players, it doesn't offer nearly as much, and downtime can be organized in a more abstracted manner. That's 7 maxims that were common in the OSR and still persist in its offspring and affiliated scenes, playstyles, and communities. Like any discussion of what the OSR was, or is, for those that believe everything is the same since 2000 or whatever, it's debatable and personal. These are simply what I take from these maxims, and how I understand them is usable, even when I am wrong. I think the process of looking at OSR truisms less dogmatically, peeling them apart, and deciding what's polemic, what's simplification, and what's actually descriptive is worthwhile to understand the possibilities and future of dungeon crawl RPGs. Oh boy. All right. that is a wicked long article. Again, thanks for all dead generations writing it out. I sort of wish that it had gone. I mean, look, blogs are personal, right? This is not an article in a some kind of big, magazine or something, right? So it's usually someone's just writing it out and probably doing minimal editing. This is something that I wish had gone through an editing pass. Not so much because I think there's a lot wrong with it, just to really drill down to the core, which is those 7 maxims and going through it, which is really just, it's like taking the Principia Apocrypha and just, saying, hey, let's reassess some of these, something like that. I think ultimately, I think it's good. I think it's doing a good thing. I think it's just a little bit wordy and could probably do it just being clear. But I think that the purpose and point of it, I think is really good. And it's something that I would maybe point to people to read, or maybe point if maybe someone can come back and distill this down a little bit to make it easier to read. Because like Ian and RPG Grandma noted, this is like 7, really this is 8, I would say comfortably 8 blog posts. One with, let's talk about what we're going to be doing, this first bit, then 1 blog post for each of the 7 maxims, and then maybe even then having a 9th one, which could be fleshing out the conclusion of the whole thing. So it's a lot of material, but I think it was good. And it's just funny because this is the one thing that I had, and I was thinking like, man, I don't know where we're going to get more stuff for today. And then this article took up over an hour. So it all worked. Before we head out, just want to remind folks that the Kickstarter for Kavlov Sanctuary, which did I paste it? I did. Is out. We have, as soon as this loads up, we didn't have our funding goal was not, it was very modest. So we've passed the funding goal. You can see here the different levels you have. And there's one of these, which is mine. Mine. Where is, wait, was it? Hey, look at that. There I am. So if we can get to $8,000, we're going to have some new stuff by me. Yours truly. So there's some good stuff on there. If you're interested in it, check it out. I posted the link in the earlier up in the chat, and it's in the community tab on YouTube. As is maybe become clear, I've got my forums on forums.hex.press. There's, if you're on Mastodon, happy to connect. I'm still trying to figure out which hashtags are good to follow. You can follow hashtags, which is great. I don't know if there's one that people are posting blog entries. I have the OSR/NSR Lemmy group. And why I'm saying this, these are all places to share articles with. Share them with me, share them with fellow folks in the community. And I really want to pull from these, especially because I've given up on Reddit. I need things to pull from. So if you are someone who's writing like RPG Grandma, writing stuff up, please share them somewhere. Tag me, ping me, at me. I'm always looking for stuff to hang out. And there you go. And that is a wrap. Ian, thanks for reposting the link for the Kickstarter. Really looking forward to that. And there may be some other stuff in the works I can't talk about quite yet. There's that. And then I'm trying to finish off my own zine, which you've watched in my working lunch threads. You've seen me trying to finish that up. So lots of stuff going on. Really excited. Hope everyone has a great and wonderful weekend, or whenever you end up watching or listening to this. If you give a thumbs up on your way out, that'd be awesome. If you found yourself in here and you're not subscribed to the channel and you liked what you saw, then feel like subscribing. That would also be awesome. And I've also got a Patreon if you'd like to support me in that way. And you can also channel memberships offered through YouTube. But ultimately, have a great rest of your day, night, whenever you end up watching or listening to this, everybody. Game on. And I will talk to you later. Bye now, everybody.